You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. Over the past few weeks, our podcast has been looking at how we talk about and understand forced migration as one of the many legacies of armed conflict. We've been interviewing a range of people who've been displaced by war themselves, and we've also been talking to artists, photographers, and academics about their efforts to change public perceptions of the so-called refugee crisis and help others visualise what forced migration involves. I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Alison Phipps. Alison is a Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Glasgow and UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Language and the Arts. Based in the School of Education at Glasgow, she teaches refugee studies, multilingual studies, religious and spiritual education, anthropology, intercultural education, and education for non-violence. She's co-convener of the Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, an ambassador for the Scottish Refugee Council, and she also chairs the New Scots Core Group for Refugee Integration in partnership with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Refugee Council, among many other high-profile advocacy and policy-making roles. She's published widely in the field of modern languages, tourism, intercultural studies and European anthropology, as well as in the field of higher education studies, and Alison is also a published poet. She's in regular demand as a speaker and commentator, especially on refugee issues, and in 2012 she was awarded an OBE for services to education and intercultural and interreligious studies. Alison, you've got a wealth of experience and expertise when it comes to understanding forced migration and the challenges that refugees face in many different parts of the world. So I'm really grateful to you for finding time in your busy schedule to talk to me today. Thank you very much for joining me, and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you very much, Alice. It's lovely to be here.
So, as I said just now, you're a Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at Glasgow, and I want to ask you about how language, cultural exchange, cultural translation and integration all feed into each other in a moment. But first, can we begin by talking a bit about the language of migration itself? So in one of our upcoming episodes, we're going to have an ancient historian on the podcast who is going to be talking about ancient discourses of mobility and migration in a world without formal political borders, when human mobility was very much the norm, not the exception. And I wonder if you could just help me and our listeners start to think about refugee language and some of the modern refugee tropes which circulate today, both in Scotland and elsewhere. What kinds of language tends to be associated with refugees and forced migration today, and why?
I mean, we're speaking in English, and yet it's a real hybrid or mongrel language in and of itself. So the way we speak about migration when we speak English is very much using tropes which have long and ancient roots. If we speak about refuge, we're looking at a word that comes out of two waves of colonial languages, Imperial Latin, and then also through that from the Norman conquest. And that's really how those Latinate languages, in their long straight lines with troops, columns and invaders, dominated and colonized a land that spoke in a different idiom from other waves of settlement and also waves of invasion coming out of, in the British Isles, coming out of Anglo-Saxon, coming out of also the Viking and Dane raids. So we have words that we use in English and that we use in academic English that have really privileged those Latin forms and those colonial lines. So I think it's always worth being a little suspicious of anything that has come down at the point of a dagger or a sword or the barrel of a gun or the threat of annihilation on the end of bombs. And that's still the case with the discourse of migration. And I think within the ways in which colonizing forces then use language to dominate and to shape narration and as propaganda. And we see that most obviously writ large across the discourse in the tabloid press in the UK at present, and the language that is used there about people who wish to come to the United Kingdom who may not be immensely rich. And there seems to be a really clear distinction. There is also a distinction around those who may be white and those who may be black. And we see that really clearly in the discourse. And there's lots of work being done in discourse analysis, particular media analysis, around that. We see all kinds of tropes that are used that are largely dehumanising, and that which, if you look at the 10 indicators of movement towards a society where genocide might be possible, are indicated from stage 4 onwards, and particularly in stage 6. So these are worrying tropes to find in a dominant press and to find unregulated. We find tropes like swarms or hordes or waves or influx, particularly, but equally, we had a few years ago, round about the time of the Brexit referendum, the Prime Minister then, David Cameron, speaking about people breaking into our country. And if we look at the language used by our Home Secretary, our present Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, then we see also highly dehumanising language that is used, which leads to dehumanising actions. It doesn't always, but certainly with the current fraught discourse around Rwanda, particularly the association of Rwanda with a country that is still trying to overcome the ways in which its languages around genocide led to one of the worst genocides that we have seen in recent history, then I think we need to be extremely cautious when looking at the language that is used, thinking about it, yes, absolutely historically, thinking about where those roots come from and being careful with the language that we use. So very much that's what I think dominates discourse about refugee and migrant experiences in English at present and the ways it is formed. But I also think there's another set of discourses that I see in advocacy and activist circles particularly, which is about a focus very much on rights. Rights as the answer, rights as the way forward, legal remedy as the possibility. And I think, again, we need to be really careful in those spaces because, as my colleague Hiab Johannes has written really brilliantly about this, rights discourses, again, tend to privilege those with access to power, those able to pay for lawyers. Andy Whiteman has spoken in Scotland. He's written a book about the poor having no lawyers. We see, particularly in England at the moment, that legal aid is almost non-existent for groups that need to access the legal system, particularly those who are seeking asylum or who may have claims relating to their own refugee status. In Scotland, it's slightly different. We do still have access to legal aid, but it's a difficult space. So that rights discourse is maybe offered as a remedy, but I think it's reflecting what are largely the beliefs and understandings of middle-class activists who see themselves still as subjects under law, whereas those coming and seeking asylum often have given up on their own ability to be people who can make remedy through the law, or certainly with any hope of quick success. And I think what for me is really interesting is looking at what people who sought asylum and who seek refuge, who may have refugee status themselves, or who have been able to avail themselves of visas which allow for humanitarian protection. What's interesting to me is the way that they speak about their experiences, and particularly how they speak about those experiences in their own mother languages, and what that then tells you about their experiences. And also how people speak about the experience of working with, hosting, living alongside refugees and asylum seekers, or people who've sought refuge and sought asylum, how they speak about that experience and what their words might be for migration. And maybe just to stay with that for a moment longer, we've recently done a special issue with the MIDEC, the Migration, Inequality and Development Research Hub, which is the world's largest research centre, and it's focusing on inequality and South-South migration. And our own work in that is to look at the languages used to characterise migration. And we have some really fantastic contributions to one of the essays in there on the language of migration from our colleagues who are working across the global south. And that's been really illuminating looking at these. So my colleague Deraje Faisa, who's in the Centre for Peace and Development in Ethiopia, has really looked at the Hadia use of language to describe migration. And he's looked at the way that some Hadia have adopted the Amharic term Sidet, meaning migration, whereas Sidet carries many negative connotations of migration. And what he does is look at the term in the Hadia for da firma, which is actually much more positive and used to signify a flow or natural order of things, something that is part of the way that life is, the way that people go about things. It means to stroll or to wander around. And he argues, I think, really powerfully that this word da firma often is used by the Hadia as almost a prophetic fulfillment of a human destiny, which may involve a precarious or perilous existence, but still means that people are meant to be there. This was a destiny that needed to come about. And I think there's other words that look at that. For example, my colleague Tawana Sitoli has written about Mufambi, meaning the traveller who would seek guidance on a journey, and who introduces the Vadzimu, who are the spiritual entities who are to intercede on behalf of Mufambi, on behalf of travellers, to offer guidance, to slow things down, to open things out, and looks at custodians of those moments of spiritual guidance that are important. So I think this brings in other dimensions. And he writes in a similar vein to my colleague Deroji, he writes about the Sango, who are the spirits of the forest, the spirits of the land, the spirits of nature, who might be offering guidance, who might close a pathway down through a thicket or a jungle, and that these become metaphors for the journeys that people make. And in looking myself at the word migration, looking at where it's come from, its colonial roots, I've also been really interested through my own adoption and respect for the land in which I've lived for the longest, which is within Scotland, looking at the Gaelic for migration and for migrants. The word Niach Imrich or Niach Falevin is really what the Gaelic would mean. And Niach means the person, the whole person, and Imrich means to flit, in the way that we often speak about it in English when you move house. But it's also got a flighty element to it, maybe even a slightly magical resonance. You know, in fairy tales, we talk about fairies flitting about or moonbeams flitting about. So again, it kind of connects with the land, but also connects with this kind of more airborne sense of movement. And this word, Niach Falavan or Falavan, also looks at the habit of walking or perambulation or locomotion. So again, connects with what my colleague Deroji in Ethiopia is speaking about, which is leaving or departing or locomotion or wandering about. And I think when we go into this etymological work of language, we can end up in a really beautiful space of intercultural connection, where we can find how people in their mother languages characterize or imagine or have looked at language in the past. And that takes us into a really different way of thinking about migration and imagining also forced migration. Because you can flit because you have to, but you can also flit because you fancied doing so, or it was your destiny, or you were the firstborn and this is what we've always done. And I think one of the lovely things that language can do, my colleague David Gramling has written brilliantly about this in his book on multilingualism and on the invention of multilingualism. It can both occlude and also offer clarity. And what colonizers want and dominant forces want is absolute clarity. It's one of the reasons why they have such a fetish about forms and tick boxes. It's either this or it's that. And we will determine what the terms are. And again, Benedict Anderson spoke about that in Imagined Communities, the way that we colonized, and the use of forms was a brilliant way of colonizers being able to say, you are either this or you are that. You are either black or you're white. You're either speaking this language or that language. You will fit into our imaginary that suits our terms. And if we depart from that, and if we go into the joy of language, the pleasure of language, the fun of it, the ways in which it can slip and slide and is semantically problematic and have many valences to it, is polyvalent, as we would say, then I think we allow ourselves a space that can be resistant, that can be playful, and that can counter these highly dehumanizing, imperial and colonizing ways in which language has long been used, and that there has always been these other ways of speaking, these other ways of encountering language, which are partly poetic, partly playful, but are an extraordinary richness that is always immensely satisfying to work with and chew on.
Thank you, Alison. Oh my goodness, you've just given us a glimpse of such a rich world of exploration there. Language as polyvalent, as you say, as elusive, meaning sometimes sitting between languages, between discourses. We know how much language can be weaponized, how much language is weaponized. And you've really given us some very powerful metaphors and images there to think about. Your phrase, words that have come down the point of the sword, the absolutely colonial nature of some of the language that we use, English, of course, being a global language and the dominant language, the language of control, and then really helping us see the values, the merits of decolonising discourses of migration, of being in that space that is both playful and a space for resistance. As you were talking about the Gaelic word for person flitting, I was struck actually by not Gaelic, but in Scotland, the Scottish way of talking about where do you live, people say, where do you stay? And just even in that distinction, there's a difference in meaning and a difference in assumption about temporariness, stability, mobility, and so on.
Yeah, and also in the Scots, there's that lovely phrase to bide, that somebody who lives with you, it can be described as you're biding in, the person who dwells with you, to bide, to abide with somebody. These are lovely, old, tenacious words, and they've clung on for a good reason, because they do better work for us than many of the ways in which language might be used to characterize the normal action of moving your body from one place to another.
Yes, which of course is hemmed in by technology and speed and so on. So you've shown us some of the problems of dehumanizing tropes, colonial discourses, but also some of the potential solutions. And that's about multilingualism, about listening to the oldness of some languages and some discourses, and all of that leading to more intercultural connection and mutual understanding. So a lot of your published research has focused on language, both as a barrier and as a tool for refugee integration. And I wonder if you can give us some concrete examples of the way in which language barriers and immigration status more generally can impact on refugee integration. So I know you've written, for example, about this in the healthcare setting. Can you talk us through either that example or another specific example that really helps us see how they intersect?
Yeah, so when we were setting up New Scots 2, so New Scots is the New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy, really interesting choice by what we now call experts by experience, people of asylum seeking or refugee background, choosing the word New Scots to describe themselves because of the stigma they saw attached to the noun asylum seeker or the noun refugee. So whilst those apply to status and have a legalistic and a useful legal function, in general life, people were saying that please just call us New Scots, and we're people a bit like others who have migrated and moved, like myself in many ways. So my migration wasn't really forced in the same way that those who have sought refuge have experienced it. So I love that word New Scots. I think we can do work with it. Not everybody likes it. There is criticism of it. That's good. That's what's needed. But it's good enough to serve the purposes that we're straining towards, I think, within Scotland, which is a rights-based, human rights-based approach to looking at integration. Now, integration itself is a hugely problematic concept, and some of the ways in which it's used, and particularly ways in which it's been used of late in England and Wales, are on a par with assimilation. Come here, do a heck of a lot of work to become like us, including language learning. And unless you really speak like a native, when we'll still really be withholding some of our generosity of status to you, we won't really accept you. We'll always be looking at ways of saying you're not really one of us, because we've got some absolute science fictional view of what one of us is. When we were doing that work, setting up New Scots 2, which ends this year, we'll be doing a new strategy, and we're in the process of refreshing the strategy at the moment. We had about 800 people who were people within the asylum system or who had been granted refugee status, who fed into the consultation process and the engagement. And what they all said, 80% of them at least, was that language and culture were the absolute fundamental building blocks of integration. Now, up until that point, we hadn't really got hard data, and we thought it's employment and education. It's having a national insurance number and it's having your status. And whilst that was seen to be important, it was much more around the 50% midline. And there was a report done by an organisation called Rocket Science that went through and looked at this as an independent scientific analysis of the consultation work. So this was great for me because I had been banging a drum for years saying, look, language is far more important than you think. And in the very first New Scots strategy, it was a footnote. It might be good if people had ESOL courses. In the second one, it was very much a strand saying it would be great if languages were understood as important. And we did some work in Scotland doing some pilots, sharing live shared languages. And we looked at both community settings for language learning, i.e. a creche where women get together with their kids and with local folk and they learn language together, learn each other's languages together, or learn English together in those settings. So something where there's a third term, it might be your baby, or it might be a cookery course, or it might be a gardening class, or it might be something crafting, or it might be a knitting club, or it might be a dance class, but where you learn language through your body, through embodying it. Scottish Refugee Council looked at enabling some of their workers to be intercultural listeners, which is a term I've used, listening to how people talk and helping them along with their language, being an accompanier in everyday life of the hard attempts that people make to speak a new language, which has not been chosen. So it's really important, I think, to say that if you choose to learn another language, like I'm choosing to learn Gaelic, it's freely chosen. Your brain is open to it, your will is open to it, your body is open to it, you're prepared to make time. If you have perhaps already got 4 or 5 languages, and then suddenly you end up, through no fault of your own, living in a country where you don't speak the language, there's no choice there. It's a harder move. And as trauma experts have shown us, it's also a lot harder for your brain in recovery mode from traumatic experiences to engage those parts of the brain that enable language learning. So language learning is really important, but it needs to be done gently. It needs to be done in a way that is about social living, which is Tim Ingold's wonderful term for a wide understanding of education. And I love it because it's education as community development, education as community education, education in classes. It's a wide sense that as we live socially, we learn. And that's where the world is a language classroom. But if we put some scaffolding in around that and enable people to understand that, as we're doing slowly but surely, project by project, language class by language class, community language learning session by sharing session, every new Scottish refugee festival that we have is increasingly multilingual, increasingly honouring of the language richness that comes with refugees and the paucity of languages that there is in the native community in Scotland, as we might call it, or the hosting or receiving community in Scotland largely, then I think we start to see things in a slightly different way. So I wouldn't want to say that language learning is kind of the answer to integration. But what I have seen is that as I've lived in a refugee family as I do, and as I have lived in refugee communities as I do, as people gain fluency in language, they gain confidence and their lives are less destituted of pleasure. The pleasure of things working more simply, the pleasure of things functioning through autonomy and agency, the pleasure of not having to speak through an interpreter. I quite like speaking through interpreters on special occasions, but not every day. The pleasure of just being able to go to school and say, and hear that your child is doing well, and receive it in your own body, in the life of yourself as a parent, that your child is doing well, and to hear it in English, but maybe also, and I'm thinking here of some of the really great little projects that have spun out from the UNESCO chair in Glasgow. I'm thinking of work that my colleague Giovanna Facetta is doing, and she'd be a great guest for your podcast. She's been working with me and with the Gaza Strip for, I think, Giovanna for the last 6 years, myself for the last 12 years. But she's set up this beautiful project on welcoming languages, where primary school teachers in schools in Scotland have been learning Arabic from colleagues in the Gaza Strip online so that they can understand words which might be words for distress or for pleasure. So those extremes of life, the pain and the pleasure, which are often the parts of our brain as well that need the most work in traumatic circumstances, and where we can't access a second or third or fourth language as easily as our mother language. Letting teachers learn those words from primary school children so that they can speak to them like that. So that if they're crying, they can say to them in Arabic, "What's wrong?" Or if they've done really well, they can say, "Congratulations." And that multilingualism becomes minutely translanguaged in the classroom setting. It's a beautiful, beautiful project. It's been immensely successful. And again, it's just expanded the space for joy in classrooms, the space of safety, and in a trauma-informed strategy, which is what we're working towards in Scotland. Safety is the first principle, moving into a return of agency, a return of pleasure to the body. And if you can make things safe, and you can often, and we know this as parents, we know this in a place of comfort, we know that to soothe, sometimes it just takes a word. I know as I speak with my grandchild, if she's crying, that actually that's where I need to go into my daughter's tongue, her mother language, so the language of my foster daughter, and I need to hold her and say, "Abaika, abaika, abaika, abaika," which is like me saying in English, it's okay, sweetheart, it's okay, it's okay. Now, if you can use language like that in a classroom setting, you bring that quality of safety, and you also say, this is a place where your trauma is welcome, and we are not afraid of your distress. And I think one of the things that in a country like Scotland that has not had a lot of experience of war in recent years and in recent generations, and where we have a very small refugee population, which has really been challenged greatly by the experience of the Ukrainian refugees coming. I mean, in Glasgow, we've got a city that was already trauma-informed and resilient from many waves of poverty, but a very different experience of violence and the war on the poor. And it was, by many thousands, the centre for dispersal in the UK of asylum seekers and refugees. We learnt the hard way over 20 years, and we're kind of canny now. We know what we're about. We know how to do this. But the whole of Scotland is now needing to do that work in every local authority. First through the Syrians in 2016, then through some of the Afghan resettlement, now through the whole of the dispersal, and through the Ukrainian super sponsorship and Homes for Ukraine schemes. We've got people on mass evacuation programs arriving in our communities directly from a war zone, but often not having seen that much war, unlike those who've come from Syria who may have had 6 years of war. So we're learning to be trauma-informed, to be able to work with trauma the hard way and rapidly with very little basis to it. And the people that we need to learn how to do this from are people like those we've been learning from in the Gaza Strip with my colleague Giovanna Facetta's programme, people who live with it every single day. What I see when we do that, again, is an ability to reach a place where our needs are satisfied, where we can reach a place where we can say, yeah, okay, we can do this. We now have enough to move forward, rather than being in a constant place of fear, which then fans the flames of xenophobia and means that people will say those terrible words, we've got to look after our own, and we haven't got enough, and we are already at breaking point, rather than actually looking at what the research shows, which is the best way for us to look after our own is to look after our own in the best way. And the best way we'll look after our own is by learning from those who know how to look after people in poverty-stricken, violated, and traumatized spaces. And those people who are now amongst us, thankfully, doing that work, they're always the first port of call, the first point of arrival. It's always the established migrant communities who are the ones who will be the first words of welcome to people who've arrived. If I land at Glasgow airport, I see the Ukraine welcome desk. I go up to them and say, thank you for doing the work they're doing. They're all from Scottish Refugee Council and volunteers. And that's a piece of work I need to do. But there'll be somebody there who can speak Ukrainian. So they're already doing that work of reception and receiving that is just so important, that friendly word that says, we can understand you. And it's both a technical statement, but also a deeply affective and affecting word to enable us to be able to do that work.
I'm really moved by the fact that that conversation has moved from the initial starting point, which is issues around refugee integration and the expectation that a host society often places on a refugee to speak like a native, to command and master a new language, as you say, in very, very challenging circumstances when there are all sorts of other issues to be dealing with and trauma to be processing. But we've moved from that to looking at alternative models where, in fact, host communities do the language learning alongside, and host communities do other kinds of learning as well, learning about trauma-informed practice, learning about the whole spectrum from providing pleasure and joy to providing safety and security, and that holistic form of looking after, and that integration being the work that we do as hosts as well as we do as new arrivals and new Scots. So it's really interesting, and you really put your finger on a very important point when you look at where some of the xenophobia, some of the hostility comes from, and it comes from a place of fear and it comes from a place of anxiety. But if we could do that intercultural learning, then we've actually got the solutions and we've got the resources that we can share in that mutual space of learning.
Yeah, I would add, what I see at the moment in the very hostile language being used by the UK government is a government that is making decisions based on fear. Now, what we know is that to make a decision based on profound fear means that you're working out of the limbic system of your brain. You're in instinctual mode, it's fight or flight, and you don't do good work in that space or in any circumstance. You will either freeze or you'll bump. And that is what we're seeing. So we are being governed by people who are profoundly afraid. And I think when I look at that as one of the psychodynamics of what we're actually experiencing, and that fear may or may not be well-founded, but it's a terrible way to live a life and to govern a population. And to govern with fear and to produce more fear is not so much good governance as an abdication of the duties to keep a population safe and free from fear. And I was really moved and enjoyed listening to Fiona Hill in her Wreath lectures on the BBC this year, and I'd really recommend it to listeners. She's very much ages with myself, and her trajectory is very similar to my own. Her background, she's from the north of England, speaks with a not dissimilar accent to mine, flattens her vowels and all those markers. But she was talking about her motivation for learning Russian and studying Russian, and it was very like mine for German. The narrative in my family was we were afraid of the Germans, and amongst my very influential grandparents on both sides. And I remember then thinking, the first opportunity I have, I want to speak German. I want to, it's my job. And I was thinking this kind of aged 8 or 9, it's my job to be able to speak German, because we need to be able to talk to people who we've been afraid of. Because if I talk to people I'm afraid of, and I learned this through bullying at school, if I speak to people, then that diminishes. And so I remember sitting with my grandfather's children's Encyclopedia Britannica, and there was a page in there where you could read words in German, and I would sit in the attic reading these in the freezing cold, kind of trying to pronounce them. And my favorite class at school was my class in German. And I went on to study French and German and started with languages, and then moved that outward into anthropology and into the arts as ways in which you can then really see the arts as a way of channeling, of decontaminating, of taking the fear away. But also, what Fiona Hill was talking about was the way that understanding, academic understanding other cultures, understanding language takes fear away, because you can see how something works. So me learning about the word for migration, where it comes from, or the word in other languages where it comes from, not only stops migration being a fearful word, but it actually makes it into a playful, enjoyable word. And it's a really simple transformation. And I know in the UNESCO chair, whenever we do workshops around language and Indigenous languages and words for things, and we invite people to start in their mother language first, the first thing that happens to people is they smile. So already you can see fear is being taken away, because you don't smile if you're fearful. You kind of suck lemons. So I do think there's something there about how we take fear away that's actually one of the ways that education, but also this kind of trauma-informed work and work of joy can actually really help be an active way of social living as education against these very fearful ways in which we are being governed.
Yeah, absolutely. You're doing a very powerful job there of underlining the vital importance of the humanities and the arts. And that brings me on to my next question. As I said when I introduced you, you're UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Language and the Arts. So I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about the work that you helped to lead in that role. You've given us some glimpses already, but how the arts can be deployed to support and facilitate refugee experiences, refugee integration.
So the field of refugee studies is one of the most over-researched at the moment, and refugees bear an enormous burden from academics, particularly social sciences, going in and extracting data and cleansing data and mining data. These metaphors are terrible. They tell of basically a kind of environmental destruction that we have wrought on the planet and now transferred over onto subjects of social scientific research. And I've written about this and the problem of these metaphors. And really, from all the work I'd done in refugee studies, but particularly in my work as an interculturalist and as a linguist, I'd really wanted to expand the frame of work, not to look at refugees, but to look at the whole ecology of living, social and cultural and intercultural living, and what I see as the kind of the miracle of the human interaction and the human encounter as a place that can inculcate fear and also produce the most profound, beautiful, enduring experiences of love in all its forms, be they familial or be they erotic, across boundaries that defy any reason. And for me, that's what makes the field of intercultural studies so utterly fascinating for the arts and the humanities. But where, through my understanding and my work on intercultural ethics, I increasingly realized that we didn't need more research on or about refugees. We've done it. The academics have done an excellent job. We have told our northern governments what needs to happen. They have that evidence. We don't need much more of it. Occasionally bits and pieces, but honestly, the choice now is about how we communicate that, how we live with the population, to decontaminate, to decolonize, and to, most of all, to de-escalate the fear in the wars that are being waged against people who we are afraid of. And so for me, it was about kind of laying down those weapons of mining, cleansing, extraction, the taking that has been social scientific paradigms, and saying, but what have we got in the arts and humanities? Those quiet, careful, steady, thoughtful, critical disciplines that are not massively well funded, but which have endured and had tenacity and been able to keep going and done this really quite often geeky work in archives. What have we got here? But also with the wonderful opening of the academy to practice in arts, to jewelry makers and poets and playwrights and artists of all kinds, seeing those people being the decontaminants, being the people who in the space of social living are like the shaman in anthropological societies, like the prophets and the spirit media, like the chaplains and the ministers, like the poets and the playwrights, these people who are vital anthropologically to human society and to our self-understanding and our future imaginary. How can we bring these people in to help with this work of understanding our fear, reducing our fear, and establishing a basis for comedy and also for lament? And I think I therefore really wanted the phrase refugee integration in the title of the UNESCO chair when we were establishing it, because it opens doors to be able to say that's not the whole story. But I wanted languages and arts because it would be an opportunity to ask the Academy, to ask UNESCO, to ask many agencies to just also offer hospitality to languages and the arts. And it therefore gives our work and others permission, because if there's a UNESCO chair in this, then everybody has permission to work with languages and arts and to learn from some of the ways in which my colleagues have been doing this. It's very much collective work. it's playful work. Some of it is work in the global south. Some of it is work within hyper-localized communities here. And we don't make a distinction as to which matters most. So projects we're currently hosting in the chair, a large project looking at New Scots and really working towards integration. We've just published a very long, detailed report with 70 recommendations for the whole of Scotland, but also internationally, about New Scots to be reframed from a focus on service delivery, which we see as important and necessary, and part of the duty of government and state and local authority and community, into something that is based on intercultural dialogue, is trauma-informed, and is conflict transformational. So we've adapted the Adrian Strang model that many of your listeners will know on refugee integration, which is 15 years old. It's done amazing work. And we've really adapted and added to it. So it now looks like a tree. I'm kind of using my hands to show it, and I know you're all listening, but it looks like a tree with the kind of the delivery of services done well, but underneath those trauma-informed intercultural dialogue, conflict transformational, beautiful, artistic, generous, generative ways of working as core to the roots that mean that the service delivery won't fall over. And what we've seen in these communities that are doing this beautiful social and cultural living really well in hosting communities. We're also working on a project at the moment that is looking at South-South migration that I mentioned at the start of the podcast. And again, it's been a wonderful project where at the point is to send the money to develop and enable scholars in the global south to do all of the research, not to gather data and give it to people in the global north to do the mining, cleansing, extracting, analysis, but to do all of that work. And for us to enable, support, develop, but largely to do the financial work and the legal work that allows for that kind of decolonising, because it's there that those big decisions are made about where resources are allocated. So that project led by Heaven Crawley has really been about allocating resource to developing South-South migration as a field across the global south and using those Indigenous conceptualizations and migrant conceptualizations that I spoke about. And then we've another project that's looking at cultures of sustainable and inclusive peace, again in the global south, but also in asylum-seeking communities in Scotland. And that's looking at 2 sustainable development goals, one on gender-based violence and another one around strong institutions. And I'm really convinced of the need of institutions. I'm happy to critique them, but I've remained within an institution all my life, despite sometimes throwing mud at it from within and at others. But I think we need strong institutions. I think there are powerful institutions in society. The church, the mosque would be some that have endured for a very long time and are first places of sanctuary for many who come. I think our local enduring cafes and restaurants, our libraries, but also our bus shelters are extraordinary places of encounter and intercultural communication. And I'm really interested in how we strengthen and sustain those. And I've recently done a report with UNESCO called We Need to Talk on Intercultural Dialogue, which has worked with the Institute for Economics and Peace and has actually measured the conditions in countries economically and in terms of propensity to indicators for intercultural dialogue to see what it takes to be a country that is not at risk of degenerating and where intercultural dialogue can be strong. Warning bells are around things like the discourse around migration, but there are indicators which show that even in really troubled and traumatic contexts where war might have broken out or where relationships have broken down, powerful, charismatic, inspiring leadership can make a huge difference, can gather people to a place of safety and possibility and make a difference. And that it is also really important to see ways in which people will organize themselves into working, especially with culture and the arts, to create a new imagination and a place that, now, as we all know from reading good books and from the way that we have many a narrative from refugees in the past, that the reading of good books can be the inspiration, can be the thing that moves you from the death wish into a life wish, from Thanatos into Eros, and allows for a place of pleasure and imagination. So these are all projects that we've really found are important and characterized deliberately with languages and the arts, so that those are in a title. They're not afterthoughts. They're not the fairy dust that's added on to a bid. But we're not just doing a little extra on the side. They are embedded as research practice from the start, with exegesis and reflection bedded into what the arts practices are that we do, as a really valued and viable way of conducting research as well.
I think one of the things that strikes me most about your answer there is the vital collaboration you really see between leaders, institutions, and more grassroots, self-organized initiatives. And it is often the case, isn't it, that things that are less well funded end up either being funded in the third sector or, on the fringes of scholarship and science, are seen as grassroots, are seen as sort of civil society, are seen as fringe, are seen as opposite to leadership and to institutions. And I'm really struck. You've talked to us about government via fear, but there's also government via inspiration and via multiculturalism, and the vital importance of having all of that come together, leadership and grassroots activity. So I think that's really striking about some of what you've been saying there.
Yeah, and I think very hard about leadership. It is problematic, as a white woman with a privileged position in an institution, which are the kind of ways we talk in the mid-range that Simone Weil has spoken of, about what it means to inhabit these roles and who it is who wants me to remain in these roles. And I do that checking very regularly with the people who matter to me, who are the asylum seeking and refugee communities, but also thinking very carefully about how we build and develop leadership within those communities. And it's not a quick thing. It's not that you can just go from arrival to knowing how a society works in a way that means that you can effectively make change happen. And that needs a lot of collaborative work. And I've really enjoyed going from being one of the people who was part of a group of maybe 10 at a demo in George Square, speaking about, Dungavel Removal Centre. And everybody there was white, because everybody who was a refugee or asylum seeker was in no way safe to come to that space. So we were there on behalf of. And, speaking at those, regularly being there. Now I still speak at quite a few demos, but usually after people who've had a good 10 years in the city, who've got status, who have protection and want to speak. And that's the important part of it. Not feel that they have to, but are scared to, but have really developed a voice.
Mm-hmm. And so it's about inclusion, and it brings us back actually to the word integration as well. It's about integrating people in all sorts of different ways, all sorts of different people, so that people can grow into different roles and learn the tacit knowledge that makes someone successful as a leader, or that makes someone successful as a persuader or as a speaker. So, Alison, there's obviously so much more I could ask you, but we've touched on a lot of very, very important things about the world-building nature of language, about intercultural exchange, communication, translation as part of the kind of work of integration that communities, host communities do or need to do as much as new arrivals. We've talked about government by fear and alternative models of government and the complex relationship between leaders and civil society, and touched on all sorts of things. As you know, our project is all about habits of visualizing forced migration, and in my conversation with you today has really helped me visualize forced migration in very new ways, just by digging into those languages and so on. But I wonder if you could just help us bring this conversation to a close by talking about, if you could change one thing about how refugees tend to be perceived, what would it be? What new habits of visualizing forced migration would you like to see becoming established?
So slightly odd one, but I honestly think that I would want the joy of it to be talked about. So the joy and the rest, I would use a theological term, that the Sabbath almost of it. So I've really come to this through having been quite seriously ill over Christmas this year. And what happened to me through that was that I realized that the people who cared and cared for me were those who had learned to care well for themselves, and whose lives have been destituted, and who don't have a lot of money or a lot of time or a lot of resource, both whilst they're on the journey or stuck in camps or when they arrive, that they have learned to find ways of wrapping the body well and caring for it, and bringing beauty and joyfulness into their lives despite it all. I wrote about that in my little book, which is great fun to write, on decolonising multilingualism, and where I just reflected on what happened to me when I couldn't speak a language at all, when I was living with a family, an extended family who were practicing waiting for many years, and where I was with them, over a period of time, and how they cared for my body in that space when it was a non-understanding body and yet was able to understand things. And they hennaed my hands, they painted my nails, they plaited my hair for hours, they dressed me in every possible which way of every possible version of traditional dress. Same with food, same with varieties of going to the market, all kinds of things, where I realized I came back from that time deeply rested because I had engaged in practices of rest. I had been wrapped, I had been cared for, I had been dressed up to feel myself as beautiful, as worthy, as dignifiable. And so if I wanted to really change anything, it would be that element that we have now within our midst, people who know how to make life dignifiable because they've learned how to do it. And that is an extraordinary gift in a burnt out, exhausted, fearful, impoverished society, and that what we have done to ourselves is destitute ourselves of rest, and that those who have, through some of our own agency, been placed in situations where they've had to work out how to make life again. And if we look over history at what exiles do, what exiles do is they keep alive the language, the poetry, the songs of home, they keep alive the dress, the traditions, the customs of home, and they keep alive the joy, the practice, the celebration of home. And it was Eritrean New Year and Christmas. I wasn't well enough to properly celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December this year, but I had the most amazing day on the 7th of January. Great amounts of cake and floating around in these amazing diaphanous gowns and laughing with children crawling all over my knee and playing at theatre festivals and things in a home. I mean, these are beautiful things to have in your life. They're things that we yearn for. They're things we have nostalgia for. Nostalgia meaning a pain for home, and it's a pain for home we have. We long for this in much of society because we've allowed the practices of capitalism to tell us that we haven't got enough and that we can't ever be satisfied. And yet what I've learned is that within our lives that we make together, if we are provided for with the basics, there is enough. There is enough, and it is a joyful thing to be able to be cared for and care for one another in these really quite simple, almost Sabbath restful ways, which are about sharing food, sharing music, clothing the body, and sitting with one another in ways which are gentle. And that is the way I would love to see the gift that I experience in the care from communities of people who offer refuge, and the abundance of that care that I have experienced and that I see offered one to another. I would want that for everybody.
Thank you. Once again, you've really transformed habits of visualizing forced migration, refugees, that focus on joy, that focus on care, on love, kindness, that focus on the contributions, the extraordinary contributions that people with different and in many cases very difficult experiences of life can bring if we open ourselves to that can counter fear. And as you say, kind of replenish and heal a world that is burnt out and destitute of the many things that really, really matter. Alison, thank you so much for talking to me today. I've learned a huge amount. I've learned to pay attention to language in much more detail, and multilingualism in particular. I'm sure our listeners have too. So thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Alice, really lovely to catch up.
Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Professor Alison Phipps as much as I did. Do keep tuning into our podcast. As I said at the start, we have a series of episodes coming out, all exploring different aspects of how we visualize forced migration as part of our wider work on war and its aftermath. You can find out more via our project website. The link is in the episode notes. If you have any questions about our work, please do get in touch. You can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising War, or contact us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zofia Gertin. Thank you for listening.